May 24, 1941, 5:52 a.m., in the icy grey waters of the North Atlantic, as the first pale light crept over the horizon and dissolved into storm-thick clouds rolling low across the heaving sea, the German battleship Bismarck cut through the waves like a steel titan born from a nation's ambition, its massive hull shuddering with the roar of engines that promised domination, destruction, and a rewriting of naval warfare. Yet on that cold morning, as spray lashed the decks and wind howled across the open ocean, no man aboard the Bismarck, not Captain Ernst Lindemann, not Fleet Chief Gunther Lütjens, not even the most seasoned sailors hardened by years at sea, could foresee that within barely 48 hours, the pride of the German Kriegsmarine would be fighting not just the British Royal Navy, but fate itself, trapped by a single mistake so small in scale, yet so catastrophic in consequence that it would erase the battleship's invincible reputation before the world's eyes and alter the trajectory of the entire Atlantic War. The story of the Bismarck did not begin on that morning, but years earlier, in German shipyards where welders, engineers, and naval architects labored under the shadow of Hitler's growing ambitions, forging a battleship unlike anything the world had seen. A behemoth armored from bow to stern, boasting guns capable of firing shells the size of small cars across distances that swallowed the horizon. A vessel intended not merely to fight, but to intimidate entire nations. Germany believed the Bismarck was unstoppable, untouchable, a floating fortress whose arrival into the Atlantic would sever Britain's supply lifelines with merciless efficiency, starving the island nation into submission long before American industry could swing the balance of the war. And for a brief moment, as the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen slipped into the shimmering blue waters of the Denmark Strait, it seemed Germany's prediction might come true, until the events that unfolded over the next few days shattered the illusion of invincibility forever. The morning of May 24th began with tension already simmering across both fleets. The British battlecruiser HMS Hood, revered as the pride of the Royal Navy, had been dispatched alongside the newly commissioned HMS Prince of Wales to intercept the German breakout attempt before the Bismarck could reach the open Atlantic. Aboard the Hood, sailors whispered about the German supership, sharing stories of its rumoured armour thickness, its terrifying main guns, its supposed impenetrability. But myth met reality in one blinding instant when the Bismarck opened fire. At 5:55 a.m., the first salvo roared from the German battleship's turrets, sending shockwaves trembling through its hull as enormous shells catapulted into the sky, arching toward the British formation like iron meteors trailing smoke. The British returned fire, but the Hood, aging, under-armoured, and vulnerable, was fatally exposed to plunging fire. And then it happened. A German shell pierced Hood's deck, igniting a magazine deep inside the ship's belly. A blinding fireball erupted, splitting the vessel in two. Within minutes, the Hood vanished beneath the waves. Only 3 sailors survived. The sinking of the Hood reverberated like a thunderclap through the British Admiralty. Shock, rage, humiliation. Churchill's command was immediate and absolute. Sink the Bismarck. But while Britain reeled, Germany basked in triumph. Aboard the Bismarck, the crew celebrated, believing they had just secured a moment that would be immortalized in naval history, the destruction of the most iconic ship in the British fleet. But even in victory, a deadly wound had been inflicted upon the German giant. During the engagement, the Prince of Wales landed several hits before withdrawing. One of them, seemingly insignificant at first, ruptured fuel tanks deep within the Bismarck, leaking precious oil across the ocean. The battleship's range was cut. The ship now had 2 choices: limp toward occupied France, or push onward into the Atlantic with crippling limitations. Admiral Lütjens chose France. It was a decision born of caution, and one that placed the Bismarck on a collision course with destiny. As the hours passed, the Bismarck became the singular obsession of the Royal Navy. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers were rerouted across thousands of miles. Ships steamed at maximum speed through rough seas. Crewmen pushed to exhaustion as they prepared for a chase that felt less like warfare and more like vengeance. The British sought not simply to defeat the Bismarck, They sought to erase it. But for nearly a full day, the Bismarck vanished into fog and spray, slipping away from radar shadows and aerial patrols. It seemed the German ship might escape after all, until a fateful sighting from a British reconnaissance plane reignited the chase. Then came the moment that turned legend into disaster. The British aircraft carrier Ark Royal launched a squadron of Swordfish torpedo bombers, slow, outdated biplanes that looked ridiculous beside the Bismarck's advanced engineering. Yet history would soon prove that old machines in skilled hands could change the course of war. The Swordfish approached the Bismarck through turbulent winds and relentless anti-aircraft fire, dodging tracers and weaving between bursts of flak. Many torpedoes missed. But one, only one, struck where no one could have predicted. It slammed into the Bismarck's stern and jammed the ship's rudder at a fatal angle. In that instant, the mightiest battleship in the Atlantic was doomed. The Bismarck could no longer steer. It could only circle helplessly as British forces closed in. With every passing hour, the once feared Titan drifted closer to annihilation. On the bridge, Captain Lindemann and Admiral Lütjens confronted the crushing reality that their invincible warship had been rendered impotent by a single torpedo delivered by a slow-moving biplane. That moment, that single hit, changed the war. As night fell and the Bismarck wallowed in the waves, unable to turn, unable to flee, unable to maneuver its guns effectively, British ships surrounded it like wolves preparing to consume a wounded giant. What followed the next day would echo through naval history: a relentless bombardment, shells smashing through armor, fires erupting along the decks, sailors fighting desperately to return fire even as their ship disintegrated beneath them. At 10:39 a.m. on May 27, 1941, the Bismarck slipped beneath the surface, swallowed by the Atlantic. Over 2,000 German sailors perished. The sinking sent shockwaves far beyond the North Atlantic. Germany lost not just a battleship, but a symbol, a weapon meant to dominate the seas. Naval confidence shattered. Strategic ambitions were crippled. The myth of German invincibility was broken, and from that moment forward, the Atlantic War shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. The disaster that destroyed the Bismarck did not begin with a battle, but with a single miscalculation. And Germany would never recover. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. May 26, 1941, 2:14 a.m., under a moon smothered by thick Atlantic cloud layers that turned the sea into a black void of shifting water and ghost-like spray, the crippled Bismarck drifted southeast at a slow, uneven crawl, its jammed rudder forcing the once mighty battleship into a broad, pathetic circle, while deep inside the ship engineers worked in feverish desperation, their tools clanging endlessly against steel as they struggled to free the rudder, the air in the compartment thick with oil, sweat, and a rising sense of dread that no amount of engineering brilliance could erase the truth settling over the crew. The pride of Germany was dying. For the men on board, the night felt like an eternity stretched thin, punctured only by the rumble of distant thunder and the occasional thud of depth charges from British destroyers stalking the Bismarck like wolves nipping at a wounded giant. Above the decks, the North Atlantic storm intensified, waves slamming against the hull with such force that some sailors wondered whether the sea itself had joined the British fleet in trying to drag the battleship down. The damage team's report reached Captain Lindemann shortly after 3 a.m. The rudder was not merely stuck. It was bent, twisted by the torpedo's impact into a shape no onboard machinery could possibly correct without access to a dry dock. The Bismarck was doomed to turn endlessly, like a wounded animal circling its own blood in the water. Lindemann felt the weight of that truth, a heaviness that pressed on his chest. He walked to the bridge windows and stared into the darkness where flashes of distant destroyer searchlights pierced the waves. He knew they were waiting, watching, calling in the British fleet that would soon descend upon them. And yet, as dawn approached, something extraordinary happened. The Bismarck fought back. At 5 a.m., British destroyers charged in for a torpedo attack, weaving through monstrous waves, but the Bismarck's gunners, exhausted, soaked, terrified, sprang into action with the discipline of veterans who refused to let their ship die without a fight. Tracer rounds arced through the early morning gloom, sweeping across the water like glowing claws, shredding the darkness. Shells slammed into British ships, forcing them to retreat. For a moment, a brief flicker of hope pulsed through the Bismarck's decks, as if the spirit of the ship itself refused to accept defeat. But hope died quickly. By mid-morning, the battleship Rodney, the King George V, and multiple cruisers converged on the Bismarck's location, guided by reconnaissance planes circling above like metal vultures. The British had waited for this moment, the chance to avenge the Hood, to erase the German Titan from the Atlantic. The Bismarck's fate was sealed, but the crew did not yet surrender to despair. Inside the radio room, operators continued sending encrypted messages to Germany, reporting the ship's worsening condition, though static and interference nearly drowned out their transmissions. In Berlin, the Kriegsmarine leadership read the updates with grim disbelief. The most powerful battleship they had ever built, a project born from national pride and enormous resources, was now trapped, helpless, unable to steer, waiting for annihilation. Naval High Command attempted to dispatch U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers to assist the Bismarck, but weather, distance, and timing made any rescue impossible. The Atlantic had never felt so vast, or so merciless. Among the crew, conversations shifted from strategy to survival. Young sailors whispered prayers. Veterans tightened their belts and cleaned their rifles in silence, unwilling to let the enemy find them unprepared. Officers moved from station to station, speaking calmly, encouraging discipline, masking their own fear beneath stoic expressions. Some wrote letters they knew would never be delivered. Others stared at photographs of their families. The storm eased briefly, revealing a cold grey sky streaked with dying moonlight, and in that moment, one sailor on deck spotted distant silhouettes on the horizon. The British fleet had arrived. The alarm sounded across the ship, echoing through steel corridors like the final heartbeat of a dying Titan. Every man rushed to battle stations. The Bismarck, unable to turn, unable to flee, prepared to face a firing line of overwhelming firepower. Captain Lindemann stood firm on the bridge, his voice steady as he issued commands. Admiral Luchen stared ahead with hollow eyes, aware that the end approaching them had been sealed by a single British torpedo. A single mistake, a single crack in what Germany believed was a perfect war machine. Below deck, the engines throbbed helplessly, pushing against the water with no direction to give. The ship shuddered as waves struck its crippled stern. And then, at 8:47 a.m., the British opened fire. The first shells screamed overhead like thunderbolts, crashing into the sea just meters from the hull. Seconds later, the Bismarck returned fire, its massive 15-inch guns roaring with earth-shaking ferocity that made the ocean vibrate. Even damaged, even doomed, the Bismarck's main battery hit back with terrifying power, sending salvo after salvo toward the Rodney. But the Rodney and King George V fired relentlessly, their shells tearing into the Bismarck's superstructure, ripping open steel, igniting fires, killing gunners before they could react. One shell obliterated a forward turret. Another smashed into the radar tower, severing critical communication lines. Smoke billowed upward into the morning sky, forming a black column that could be seen for miles. Yet the Bismarck still fought. Its secondary guns spat fire. Machine guns rattled against incoming torpedoes. Damage control teams crawled through smoke-filled hallways, dragging hoses, coughing, shouting orders. Men burned. Men drowned. Men refused to leave their stations even as fire crept around them. Lindemann gave the order to keep firing until the last shell, the last breath, the last heartbeat. The sea around the Bismarck boiled with explosions. Cruisers closed in, launching torpedoes. Battleships pounded the hull at point-blank range. The Bismarck's deck became a torn landscape of steel and flame, but still the German flag flew atop the mast, defiant, refusing to fall. As the battle raged, sailors in the lower compartments felt the ship starting to list. Water poured in through ruptured bulkheads. The stern sank lower. Pumps failed. The giant was collapsing from the inside out. And yet, no one abandoned ship. Orders were clear. Fight until the ship dies. By 10 a.m., the Bismarck was a smoking wreck, its turrets silenced, its engines failing, its guns twisted into molten shapes. Admiral Lütjens was killed at his post. Captain Lindemann vanished in the chaos, believed to have been crushed by falling debris. Still, pockets of sailors fought on, firing machine guns at British destroyers that now circled the crippled battleship like sharks. A final torpedo, launched from the cruiser Dorsetshire, slammed into the Bismarck's side. The ship groaned, shuddered, and began to roll. Inside, men prayed, screamed, or stared silently at the tilting floor as the lights flickered and seawater surged through ruptured vents. At 10:39 a.m., the Bismarck capsized. The ocean swallowed Germany's pride. The screams of drowning sailors echoed across the waves as British ships hesitated, torn between rescue and orders. Only a few hundred were saved before U-boat threats forced the British to withdraw. Over 2,000 men vanished beneath the waves. The disaster shattered the Kriegsmarine's confidence. The myth of German naval invincibility was gone, and deep within the Atlantic, as the Bismarck sank into cold darkness, the world changed, not from a battle lost, but from a single mistake Germany could never undo. May 27, 1941, 11:12 a.m., as the last swirling bubbles from the sinking Bismarck faded into the steel-colored Atlantic and the waves closed like a tomb over the remains of Germany's greatest warship, the vast ocean fell into an uncanny silence, broken only by the distant rumble of retreating British engines and the faint cries of German survivors drifting across the water, clinging to debris, oil-slicked and shaking, wondering whether the cold sea or the war itself would claim them first. While thousands of miles away in Berlin, the news had begun its slow, devastating journey toward the desks of commanders who had believed the Bismarck untouchable, and now felt the floor beneath them shift as though the entire naval doctrine of Germany were collapsing with it. The Admiralty in Berlin, already tense from the realities of a long war, paused when the first coded message came through, describing severe damage, but the full truth arrived in fragments, radio intercepts, and British broadcasts gloating that the Bismarck had been sunk, and with each confirmation, a deeper silence settled over the high command. In the grand war rooms, men stared at maps covered in red lines plotting U-boat patrols and surface radar routes that suddenly seemed meaningless without the battleship that had been intended to dominate the Atlantic. Officers removed their caps. Some cursed. Others simply sat down, unable to process that a ship considered a symbol of national strength had been destroyed before it ever completed a single wartime mission. The shock spread like a cold wind through every corridor of command, from the Kriegsmarine HQ to Hitler's inner circle. When Hitler received the news, his reaction was not explosive rage but a strange, brooding quiet, followed by an accusation that the Navy had lied to him about the ship's capabilities. He had never fully trusted his admirals, and now he treated the loss not merely as a military failure but as a personal betrayal. He questioned every battleship, every surface operation, every doctrine. That moment marked a turning point. Germany's surface fleet, once imagined as a rival to Britain's Royal Navy, was effectively dead. Meanwhile, in Britain, the sinking sparked a wave of jubilation mixed with solemn remembrance. In mess halls, pubs, and ports across the nation, sailors raised glasses to the Hood, to vengeance fulfilled, to the Royal Navy's enduring supremacy. But beneath the celebration, commanders understood a deeper truth. The battle had revealed how fragile even the strongest ships could be, how naval warfare was shifting away from battleships toward carriers, aircraft, and submarines. Those who studied the battle saw it not as a triumph of brute force, but as the dawn of a new era. In that sense, The Bismarck had not only died, it had demonstrated the death of an entire philosophy of war. Back in the Atlantic, the survivors' ordeal unfolded with brutal simplicity. The British destroyers, spotting German sailors waving from wreckage, attempted to retrieve as many as possible, but the threat of U-boats forced them to break off rescue after only minutes. Hundreds of men still calling for help were left behind as British ships accelerated away, leaving the ocean eerily quiet once more. Hours later, a German U-boat and a weather ship found a few remaining survivors clinging to life. Many others had already succumbed to exposure. Their testimonies, taken days later, read like the last words of a dying civilization. They spoke of explosions ripping through steel corridors, of fires swallowing compartments, of the ship trembling as though alive and refusing to sink, of officers shouting over howling wind, of friends disappearing into smoke or water. They described the final moments on deck, the sky glowing orange from burning oil, the air thick with steam, the deck tilting sharply as the battleship rolled, and the terrible cracking sound of metal twisting as the Atlantic swallowed the Bismarck whole. For the survivors, the ocean had become a graveyard for more than 2,000 comrades. In Germany, the loss reshaped strategy overnight. Rudder, the commander of the Kriegsmarine, defended the surface fleet, but his influence faded as Hitler turned his gaze toward U-boats. The new directive was clear. Großadmiral Karl Dönitz and his wolf packs would carry the burden of the Atlantic War. Never again would Germany invest such faith in a massive battleship. The Bismarck's sister ship, Tirpitz, would spend much of its operational life hiding in fjords, used more as a psychological threat than an active combatant. Hitler forbade any major surface operation that carried even the slightest risk. The death of the Bismarck had not just ended a mission, it had ended Germany's confidence in its own navy. Newspapers across the world painted the event in mythic colors. In London, headlines declared the end of the Atlantic terror. In Washington, analysts dissected the battle, realizing how vulnerable even the most advanced ships were to aircraft, a lesson the U.S. Navy would soon face at Pearl Harbor and Midway. In Tokyo, Japanese architects studying the Bismarck's design noted both its armor strengths and its fatal weaknesses. Around the world, military strategists pored over diagrams and reports, concluding that naval warfare had changed forever. And yet, the loss also did something unexpected. It electrified Allied morale. In the middle of Britain's darkest year, when London still burned from the Blitz, when shortages ravaged homes, when invasion felt possible, the destruction of the Bismarck became a symbol, a promise that Britain could still fight back, that its navy could still stand against tyranny, that even the greatest weapon of the enemy could fall. Sailors carried that story with them across convoy routes and Arctic runs. Airmen spoke of it in briefing rooms. Even civilians whispered about it during nightly blackouts. The sinking became a narrative of hope wrapped in steel, smoke, and sacrifice. Meanwhile, deep in Germany's naval academies, young officers studied the Bismarck with a reverence bordering on grief. They ran simulations of torpedo trajectories. They replayed the Denmark Strait battle frame by frame. They memorized the final transmissions. But most of all, they fixated on the moment everything changed, the single torpedo from a slow-moving British biplane that jammed the rudder. It was the detail that haunted them, a reminder that war turned not on strength or size, but on moments of chance, miscalculation, and human ingenuity. 4 years afterward, whenever German cadets learned naval doctrine, instructors would pause at that lesson, the jammed rudder, because it symbolized the fragility of even the most powerful war machine. The Bismarck became a warning carved into the memory of every commander who believed a weapon could be perfect. Yet the ship's ghost lingered on. Fishermen reported strange echoes on sonar where the wreck lay miles below. Survivors dreamed of steel corridors filling with water. British veterans remembered the sight of the burning giant rolling beneath the waves. Even decades later, Robert Ballard's expedition discovered the wreck and confirmed the story. The Bismarck had been destroyed not because its armor failed, but because it had been left unable to move, a lion brought down by a single wound. That truth, when revealed to the world, changed the way history saw the battle. It was no longer merely a victory of the Royal Navy. It was a moment when fate, physics, and war converged into a single point of failure. A moment when a naval empire lost its future. A moment when one mistake, not on a battlefield, but in a decision, reshaped the Atlantic War. And as decades passed, the legend of the Bismarck grew not weaker, but stronger, because its story was never about a ship. It was about the fragile line between dominance and disaster, between confidence and catastrophe, between victory and the one mistake a nation could never recover from. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. May 27, 1941, 4:52 p.m., as the sun dipped low behind a wall of darkening Atlantic clouds and painted the horizon in bruised shades of purple and steel, the shockwaves of the Bismarck's destruction rippled far beyond the cold waters where the wreck now rested, reaching every corner of the war, shifting perceptions, altering strategies, and reshaping the morale of nations that had watched the giant rise and fall within the span of a single mission, its life brief yet monumental, its death a symbol of how swiftly the tides of war could change when a single error tipped the balance. In the days immediately following the sinking, British intelligence teams raced to compile a comprehensive analysis of the battle, piecing together eyewitness accounts from sailors, pilots, and commanders who had participated in the hunt. The Admiralty wanted answers, not out of doubt, but out of fear. The Hood's destruction still lingered like a wound carved into the soul of the Royal Navy, and though the Bismarck had been avenged, the question remained: how had such an overwhelming warship been allowed to sail into the Atlantic at all? The inquiry revealed disturbing truths about British communication lapses, intelligence delays, and the Royal Navy's dangerously thin resources at the time. The loss of the Hood had been a wake-up call, but the chase for the Bismarck had exposed just how fragile Britain's control of the Atlantic had become in 1941. The sinking brought relief, but also urgency. Britain needed more ships, faster ships, better aircraft, improved radar, and most of all, stronger coordination between sea and air forces. Meanwhile, in Germany, the reaction was very different. In the halls of the Reich Chancellery, whispers spread that Hitler was furious, viewing the defeat not merely as a naval disaster, but as a personal humiliation. He summoned senior naval officers to his headquarters in Bavaria, where the atmosphere thickened with dread long before he entered the room. When he spoke, it was with the cold, clipped tone he reserved for betrayal. He accused the Navy of gross incompetence, of deceiving him about the ship's true capabilities, of sending a vessel into danger without proper reconnaissance or escort. He declared that battleships were relics, obsolete, unreliable, vulnerable. He slashed surface fleet operations, drastically limiting the freedom of the Kriegsmarine. It was a turning point that crippled German naval ambition for the rest of the war. For Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the Navy, the loss of the Bismarck became a personal shadow that followed him relentlessly. Once confident, once respected, he found himself increasingly marginalized, as Hitler shifted full trust toward Karl Donitz and his U-boat fleet. Raeder's dream of a balanced navy, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, evaporated. The Kriegsmarine would now fight almost exclusively beneath the waves. And in that shift, Germany's naval war grew both deadlier and more desperate. Across the Atlantic, U-boat wolf packs tightened their grip on shipping lanes, sinking merchant vessels by the dozens. The Allies, who had celebrated the Bismarck's sinking as a triumph, now faced a new threat, silent, invisible, and far harder to hunt than any surface ship. Yet the psychological blow to Germany from the Bismarck's sinking was impossible to hide. Newsreels in Berlin, carefully edited to maintain morale, referred to the ship as having fallen in glorious battle. But even Nazi propaganda could not mask the truth that a symbol of German industrial might have been destroyed. In factories, Workers whispered about the disaster. In naval academies, cadets studied the ship's last hours with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. In shipyards, engineers quietly questioned whether any battleship could survive in an age of aircraft and long-range torpedoes. Even U-boat crews, considered the elite of the Navy, felt the impact. They saw the Bismarck's death as a stark reminder that no vessel, no matter how strong, was safe from the growing reach of Allied reconnaissance and air power. As summer of 1941 settled over Europe, the loss of the Bismarck cast a longer shadow. It emboldened Britain, morale soaring at a moment when the island nation desperately needed hope. Churchill used the victory in speeches that would echo across the world, calling it proof that the British spirit could overcome even the most formidable enemy machine. The story of the hunt, the relentless pursuit, the torpedo hit from an antiquated biplane, the final stand, became legend. British schoolchildren learned the names of the Hood and the Bismarck. Newspapers printed dramatic illustrations. Radio broadcasts recounted the battle in breathless detail. In the United States, still months away from entering the war, the tale of the Bismarck circulated among naval strategists who recognized instantly what it meant. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would dominate the future. American intelligence studied the torpedo strike that jammed the rudder. They studied how the Bismarck evaded detection. They studied how the Royal Navy coordinated their assets across an ocean. And when the U.S. Navy fought at Coral Sea and Midway, these lessons would quietly shape decisions that changed the outcome of the Pacific War. Yet the story of the Bismarck did not end with strategy or politics. It ended at the bottom of the North Atlantic, where the wreck descended into silent darkness. As it fell, the massive hull broke in places, metal folding inward, flames extinguished by crushing water pressure. Entire compartments imploded. Once thunderous engines went quiet forever. The great guns that had destroyed the Hood now slept beneath sediment and silt, and the thousands of men who had served on the ship, proud, disciplined, unwavering, remained in the memories of the few survivors who had lived to tell the tale. One survivor later recalled, "When the ship rolled over, I heard a sound like a mountain collapsing. I saw men sliding across the deck into the sea. Some were still firing their guns. Others were praying. Others were silent. And then the ship was gone." His voice had cracked as he spoke, the weight of memory pressing down even after decades had passed. The Bismarck's end was not just the death of a battleship. It was the death of an idea, the idea that steel and armor alone could guarantee victory against a world that was rapidly learning to fight in new ways. And as the war continued, as aircraft carriers launched swarms of planes across oceans, as radar and sonar evolved, as submarines stalked convoys in the dark, the Bismarck began to feel like a monument to another era, a final giant standing between the age of battleships and the age of air power. Yet despite this shift, the ship's legacy endured. Even those who fought against it would admit, in memoirs and interviews long after the war, that the Bismarck had been one of the most formidable vessels ever built. Its guns were unmatched, its armor nearly impenetrable, its construction a marvel of engineering. But it was doomed not by its weaknesses, but by the belief that it was invincible. And in war, nothing is more dangerous than believing you cannot fall. For Germany, that belief shattered on May 27, 1941. For Britain, it became a symbol of resilience. For the world, it became one of the most dramatic naval stories ever told. And for the cold Atlantic, it became another grave, silent, eternal, vast. May 28, 1941, 6:15 a.m., as a pale grey dawn spread over the North Atlantic like a thin shroud, the full weight of the Bismarck's loss began to settle across Europe, sinking not only into the cold depths of the ocean but into the minds of sailors, civilians, commanders, and nations who understood that something profound had shifted, that the world's oceans, once dominated by steel giants, were no longer governed by brute force alone, but by information, coordination, air power, and the relentless logic of modern warfare. In Berlin, news of the ship's destruction spread through the naval ministry like a slow-moving storm, gathering dread as officers whispered the truth behind closed doors. Within hours, Admiral Rudder convened a tense meeting with his senior staff, their faces drawn tight, uniforms immaculate but spirits shaken. Charts were spread across a long table, showing North Atlantic routes, convoy patterns, and Germany's shrinking surface fleet. The Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, remained afloat, but the loss of her twin cast a long shadow. Rudder ran his fingers along the edge of a chart, as though searching for a different outcome, but the facts were impossible to ignore. "We underestimated the speed of British coordination," he said quietly, "and we overestimated the isolation in which our ships could operate." Officers exchanged glances. No one dared mention what they all knew. The Bismarck had been designed to operate with support, with air reconnaissance, with escorting cruisers, with intelligence guiding its movements. Yet Germany had sent it into the Atlantic with almost none of those advantages. One officer finally broke the silence, his voice low. "Herr Admiral, the Führer blames us entirely." Rudder closed his eyes. He already knew. Hitler had raged through the night, pacing like a caged animal, muttering that the Navy had humiliated him, that the battleship he had promised would dominate the oceans had lasted barely a week in combat. The consequences of that fury would shape Germany's naval war for years. Within 48 hours, Hitler ordered strict limits on all future surface ship operations. No battleship was to risk open confrontation. No cruiser was to enter contested waters. Even the mighty Tirpitz was confined to the fjords of Norway, becoming little more than a symbolic threat, a floating prison. In that moment, Germany's dream of challenging Allied sea power died. The naval officers left the meeting with grim expressions, their footsteps echoing through marble hallways like the slow tolling of a funeral bell. Many understood, even if they never said it aloud, that the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet had effectively ended on the same day the Bismarck sank beneath the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the British Admiralty was buzzing with a very different kind of energy. In smoky war rooms lit by dim lamps and cluttered with coffee-stained maps, officers spoke with hoarse voices, recounting the chase, the torpedo strike from the ancient Swordfish biplane, the final bombardment. Some replayed the moment they heard the message, "Sink the Bismarck." Others remembered the radio silence afterward, the heavy pause before confirmation arrived. Though victory filled them with pride, it also filled them with awareness. Had they failed to jam the rudder, had they failed to locate the Bismarck before it reached France, the war in the Atlantic could have turned catastrophic. The Prime Minister sensed the psychological importance of the moment. Churchill insisted the newspapers emphasize the triumph, not to gloat, but to reassure a shaken nation that Britain still had strength, still had teeth, still had men capable of turning the tide even against Germany's greatest machines. Headlines blared across breakfast tables. Bismarck destroyed, Hood avenged, and for the first time in months, British morale surged. Yet even as people celebrated in pubs and factories, naval analysts in quiet offices were dissecting every detail of the battle. They saw how close Britain had come to disaster. They saw how dangerous Germany's battleships could be. They saw the growing threat of U-boats that still prowled the Atlantic with deadly effectiveness. And they saw something else, something that would reshape Allied strategy. Battleships were no longer kings. Aircraft were. The Swordfish torpedo strike became a case study overnight. Military thinkers marveled that such a slow, outdated aircraft, almost laughable in design, had delivered the decisive blow of the chase. It wasn't the plane that mattered. It was the ability to project force across distance. America paid close attention. 8 months before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had watched the entire Bismarck chase like a live demonstration of the future. American naval officers began rethinking their war plans. Battleships, once the pride of every fleet, were now vulnerable in ways no one had fully acknowledged. Carriers, once dismissed as auxiliary ships, now seemed indispensable. At naval academies and war colleges across the United States, instructors used the Bismarck as an example of how technology, coordination, and reconnaissance would define all future wars. West Point cadets studied the chase as a lesson in persistence under uncertainty. Annapolis midshipmen memorized the turning radius of the Bismarck with a jammed rudder. The entire military absorbed the same truth: no giant was invincible. In Germany, however, the sinking of the Bismarck took on a far darker tone. Propaganda machines attempted to soften the blow, calling it a courageous sacrifice, a heroic stand against overwhelming odds. But German sailors, soldiers, and citizens saw through the thin veil. They whispered that the mighty Kriegsmarine had failed. They murmured that perhaps Hitler's promises of naval supremacy had been illusions. And they wondered, if Britain could hunt down their greatest battleship in open ocean, what could Britain and its allies do next? The emotional toll within the Navy was immense. Survivors from the Bismarck were sent into isolation, both for medical treatment and for propaganda reasons. Their testimonies were considered dangerous, reminders of defeat. But even in their isolation, they carried memories of the ship's final hours. The deck shaking under bombardment, the corridors filling with smoke, the sound of steel tearing like cloth, the sensation of the ship rolling beneath their feet as she took her final plunge. Some survivors later wrote in diaries that they felt a strange mix of pride and grief, pride in how fiercely the ship had fought, grief in knowing it had all been for nothing. As weeks passed, the Bismarck became more than a ship. It became a symbol of hubris, of power, of vulnerability. Naval strategists across the world debated what had doomed her. Some blamed the rudder. Some blamed the weather. Some blamed the decision to send her out without proper escort. But the truth was more complex. The Bismarck failed because the world had changed. The ocean was no longer a chessboard dominated by battleships. It had become an arena of aircraft, code-breaking, radar, and long-range coordination. Britain had embraced that change. Germany had not. In an office deep within the Admiralty, a young analyst named Peter Ashworth drafted a memo that would influence Allied naval thinking for the rest of the war. It read, in part, "The Bismarck's destruction proves that a single technological vulnerability, if exploited, can neutralize even the strongest of ships. Future warfare must center not on armor, but on information and reach." That idea would echo across Allied planning, from convoy escorts to carrier task forces, from submarine deployment to the invasion of North Africa. Meanwhile, Hitler's anger deepened into resentment. He began blaming his admirals for failures rooted in his own unrealistic expectations. He complained that they lacked vision, lacked courage, lacked understanding of modern war, even though he was the one refusing to modernize the fleet. In private, generals shook their heads. They knew the truth. Hitler had just lost faith in the surface fleet entirely, and once he lost faith, nothing could revive it. As the summer of 1941 advanced, Germany turned fully toward its invasion of the Soviet Union, an operation so vast, so dangerous, that even the most optimistic officers sensed doom on the horizon. The Navy, now sidelined, could do little more than watch. In the cold waters where the Bismarck lay, currents drifted silently over the broken hull, carrying away sediment, smoothing torn steel edges, burying the ship slowly beneath the ocean floor. The men who died aboard her rested in the cold, dark quiet, far from Germany, far from the war, far from any hope of recognition in a conflict that would only grow more brutal with time. Yet even as the ship disappeared into the depths, her story remained very much alive above the waves. In London, Churchill invoked her name whenever he needed to remind the British people that the fight was far from over, but winnable. In Washington, Naval officers referenced her demise as they prepared a new generation of officers for a war they knew was coming. In Berlin, the ship became a taboo topic, a reminder of failure the regime wanted to bury along with the wreck. But history does not bury its giants so easily. The Bismarck's death had become a turning point, a moment when illusions shattered, when strategies shifted, when nations recognized that warfare was evolving faster than even the bravest crews or strongest hulls could adapt. The Atlantic had claimed the mightiest battleship Germany ever built, but it had also claimed something far greater, the very idea that steel alone could shape the course of a war. May 30th, 1941, 8:42 p.m., as the North Atlantic sky faded into a deep indigo twilight and the wind carved long sweeping lines across the cold surface of the ocean, a quiet settled over the waves where the Bismarck had vanished only 3 days earlier, a silence so profound that it felt as though the sea itself was absorbing the echoes of the battle that had ended the Kriegsmarine's greatest hope. And across Europe, in Berlin, in London, in Washington, in every naval command room where charts of convoy routes and ocean lanes were studied with relentless intensity, the consequences of the ship's destruction began to unfold in ways no commander could ignore, shaping strategies, altering expectations, and redefining the very meaning of naval power in the modern age. For Germany, the psychological blow penetrated deeper than any torpedo could have, striking at the core of Hitler's naval ambitions he had paraded in speeches and propaganda reels, ambitions built on dreams of resurrecting the mighty high seas fleet of World War I. Hitler had imagined a future where German battleships roamed the Atlantic uncontested, where British shipping lanes were strangled, where convoys withered under relentless bombardment, and where the Royal Navy, symbol of British pride for centuries, bent under the weight of German steel. But the sinking of the Bismarck shattered that fantasy in a single stroke, leaving Hitler pacing in a fury inside his headquarters, railing at his admirals, blaming incompetent decisions, sabotaged plans, and what he perceived as weakness within the naval hierarchy. His tantrums were so severe that officers avoided eye contact when summoned, fearing the wrath that had already ended careers within a day of the Bismarck's demise. Hitler declared that no German battleship was ever again to leave harbor without his explicit permission. In that decree lay the death sentence for Germany's surface fleet. The Tirpitz, sister to the Bismarck and nearly identical in power, became a caged animal in the Norwegian fjords, trapped under constant Allied surveillance, eternally threatened by bombers, midget submarines, and daring commando raids. It would spend the rest of the war hiding rather than fighting, a stark contrast to the bold, aggressive vision Hitler had once proclaimed. Admiral Rudder, humiliated and losing influence, confided to close colleagues that the Navy's future had been stolen not by the British, but by their own Führer's fear. The Bismarck's loss had not just sunk a ship, it had sunk an entire doctrine. Across the Channel, the reaction in Britain was radically different. The victory brought a surge of confidence at a moment when the nation desperately needed it. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was weeks away. France was occupied. U-boats ravaged the seas, and nightly bombing raids shook the cities. But the news that Britain had hunted down and destroyed the most feared battleship in the world became a symbol of resilience. In pubs filled with cigarette smoke and stale beer, sailors reenacted scenes from the chase, mimicking the rumbling dive of Swordfish aircraft or the booming salvos of the King George V. In factories, workers cheered as newspapers splashed the headline, "Bismarck sunk," in bold black letters. Yet beneath the celebration, the Admiralty understood a deeper truth. The victory had been precarious, a triumph made possible by courage, luck, radar, and relentless pursuit, not raw superiority. Admirals gathered in conference rooms and pored over detailed reports, analyzing every phase of the hunt with forensic precision. They saw how quickly the Bismarck had destroyed the Hood. They recognized the vulnerability of outdated ships. They recognized that battleships, for all their grandeur, were no longer decisive instruments of war. The future lay elsewhere, in fast carriers with long-range strike capability, in submarines that could stalk convoys from the depths, in aircraft that could project power far beyond the line of sight. One British admiral summarized the lesson in a single sentence scribbled in his notebook. "We did not sink the Bismarck with guns. We sank her with information." And he was right. The battle had been won not with brute strength but with coordination. Signals intercepted, aircraft launched from hundreds of miles away, destroyers tracking the German ship through the night, cruisers shadowing her from the edge of the horizon, radar screens pulsing with faint echoes that spelled life or death. The Americans, watching closely from across the Atlantic, absorbed every detail. Though still officially neutral, the United States Navy devoured the after-action reports with academic hunger, holding lectures, updating doctrines, and revising operational plans. At the Naval War College in Newport, officers studied maps of the Bismarck chase late into the night. They discussed how a single torpedo from an obsolete plane had crippled the most sophisticated warship in Europe. They dissected the vulnerabilities of heavy armor in the age of air power. They concluded, long before Pearl Harbor, that the battleship era was dying and a new age of aviation warfare had begun. Meanwhile, deep in the Atlantic, U-boat commanders received word of the Bismarck's sinking with a mixture of shock and grim realization. They understood that the Royal Navy's surface fleet would now redirect even more resources into hunting submarines, and that armed with confidence, Britain would fight with renewed intensity. Some U-boat captains wondered whether the loss of the Bismarck would harden Germany's resolve or fracture it. Others saw something even more ominous. If a single aircraft could cripple a battleship, what might aircraft do to submarines once technology advanced? And they were right to worry. The seeds of Germany's future naval catastrophe had already been planted in the Bismarck's grave. Far from Europe, in the Pacific, Japanese admirals read the same reports and drew conclusions of their own. They saw how vulnerable even the strongest battleship had been to air-dropped torpedoes. They saw how relentless reconnaissance and coordination could isolate and destroy a ship. Some in the Imperial Japanese Navy quietly questioned whether battleships still held value compared to carriers. Doubts that would become prophetic 6 months later at Pearl Harbor and a year after that at Midway. But none of this mattered to the men who had survived the Bismarck. In a British infirmary, several German sailors lay in clean beds, bandaged, weary, haunted. They remembered the final moments of the ship, the deck tilting violently, explosions echoing through steel corridors, the cold rush of seawater, the cries of dying men, the desperate scramble to reach the open air. Some remembered looking back as the Bismarck's stern rose briefly from the waves before she slipped beneath, disappearing forever. These men became silent witnesses to the end of an era. Many would later write memoirs describing not just the terror of battle, but the crushing realization that their ship, the pride of Germany, had been outmatched not by a superior battleship, but by superior strategy. Back in Germany, their testimonies were suppressed. Hitler refused to acknowledge the strategic significance of the disaster. To him, the sinking was a betrayal, a humiliation imposed upon him by a navy he deemed incompetent. This resentment would poison his decisions for the rest of the war, leading to irrational orders, the sidelining of experienced commanders, and ultimately, the collapse of German naval ambitions. As the months passed and the war grew darker, the Bismarck's hull settled deeper into the silt of the ocean floor. Barnacles clung to her once proud armor. Deep-sea creatures drifted through shattered compartments. A cold, eternal quiet enveloped the steel giant. But her story did not fade. Allied crews spoke of her in hushed reverence. German sailors carried her memory like a wound. Historians traced the ripple effects of her loss through entire campaigns. And commanders across the world recognized that the sinking of the Bismarck was not merely the destruction of a ship, it was the destruction of a belief system, the belief that size equals strength, the belief that armor equals safety, the belief that the ocean belonged to battleships. The Bismarck's final lesson, the lesson that reshaped the Second World War, was brutally simple. In modern war, The greatest mistake is refusing to adapt. And Germany paid for that mistake at the bottom of the Atlantic, where the wreck of the Bismarck rests to this day, a silent monument to a turning point in history, a graveyard of steel and ambition, a reminder that even the greatest giants can fall when the world around them changes faster than they are willing to understand. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.